But there's something much more that goes on when we approach exercise and training in the way that I've presented it in that program. And I want to share just a couple of those things with you right now. If you're listening to this as a runner, then obviously it's your sport. But if you're a triathlete, you know, they're running off the bike and maintaining speed, not losing speed, staying strong, going faster. And the reason running's so critical, obviously, is it's the sport where there's the greatest amount of forces acting on our body, and therefore our body has great responsibility to respond to those forces and hopefully utilize some of that energy. When we say that running, you know, when you run, you're landing with 3 to 4 times your body weight in terms of force. That's significant. It's not an insignificant thing. I mean, we say it sort of haphazardly, but the reality is if you weigh 150 pounds, you know, 3 times your body weight is 450 pounds of force. The first term that I want to introduce that I haven't ever mentioned before is a term called muscle slack. The analogy is it's exactly like a guitar string. You got 2 end points of the muscle, and when it's at rest, it's sort of slack like a guitar string that is in tension. And if you go and try to pluck on that string, excuse me, and try to play the guitar when the string isn't taut, you get no sound, and in fact the risk of breaking that string is pretty high. And what often happens in many athletes who get injured or who don't generate speed or power is there is a delay from that point where the muscle tissue is at rest and there's slack in that muscle to the point where they begin to generate force, whereas to say the muscle tenses or shortens. And that speed of tensioning is really important because the faster that we can generate that tension and take out the slack, the more power ultimately that we'll be able to generate and the more force we'll be able to generate. When we have muscle slack, there's basically 2 things that we can do to overcome it. One is a counter movement. So all of the things that you see in sport, whether it's the golfer who's bringing the club back, or the baseball player who's bringing the bat back, swinging the leg back before kicking a ball. These are all counter movements that take out muscle slack and pre-tense the muscle to be able to generate force. The problem is a lot of the things that we do, there isn't time for that counter movement. In some instances there is. As an aside, a baseball player, when they have that bat up, you'll see that there's a lot of movements and motions, and typically we think of these things as weird quirks that these players do, but the reality is what they're doing is they're pre-tensing the muscle to take out a little bit of that slack, which will allow for them to generate more power through the swing. That's exactly why that happens. There's 2 things that we can do to overcome muscle slack. One is a counter movement, and 2 is pre-tensing the muscle. So in this program, what we're doing, as you know, is creating as much tension as we can. And that tension is a co-contraction. So it isn't trying to tense one muscle group, but it's all of the muscle groups. As you know, I've encouraged you to bring maximal tension into the movements that we're doing wherever we are. And if we're not moving, that tension is isometric. And if we are moving, then that tension is not purely isometric. It either is concentric or eccentric, but the point of the story is there's a threshold where there's pre-tension and co-contraction, but also movement. That pre-tensing and generating that ultimately generating more tension is a skill. And that co-contraction basically stabilizes the joint. If I could look at any of you folks who have gone through it, or anyone else that went through approaching the exercises in the way that we've laid them out, the intense maximal co-contraction of the muscle increased stability of the joint and essentially helped the body to better protect the joints. So there's a huge injury resistance component to that, which is a skill. The more you practice that, the better you get at it, the better your body gets at pre-tensing prior to movement to better stabilize and protect the joints. Hence, you can literally, from doing a push-up correctly, where you're creating maximal tension and co-contraction, front, back, sides of your body, you are creating a protective mechanism for the joints in your body by improving its neurological ability, the nervous system, central nervous system, to create that pretension. The other thing is the speed of that building up of tension. So when you go from muscle slack to the point where the muscle's being asked to do work, there's a curve, and that tension curve can either be quite fast or quite slow. And naturally, it's not rocket science to say, hey, in running, when the foot hits the ground, we have a very, very small amount of time to generate maximal tension. That is to say, to produce maximal force into the ground while also resisting the forces that are acting on our body. So when your body is moving, right? And let's just look at running. When the foot comes down and lands on the ground, for a moment in time, the contractile elements of the muscle, let's say in the quad and the calf and whatever in the hamstring, for a moment in time, they are isometrically contracting to resist those forces. But the elastic components of the muscle are stretching. And that stretching, of course, is tensing to create an elastic rebound and also stretching to absorb the forces acting on the body. One of the reasons why I emphasize strength so much is because those contractile elements of the muscle that for a moment are isometric in nature as we land, the stiffer those muscles can make our body. In other words, maximal strength of those muscles means that over and over and over again, 1,500 times in a mile, many miles one on top of another, those muscles have to act below their strength threshold. So the higher that strength threshold is, the better they can be at working submaximally. They create tension and stiffness in that moment, which means that they're resisting those forces, again, at that submaximal level, which allows the elastic components to do their work. It's my belief that when we look at fatigue late in races, ultimately it's the strength that diminishes and not so much that we're running out of fuel. So it's why I emphasize the strength aspect so much, especially maximal strength. And there's also an interesting element to this as well, too, and I don't want to get too complicated, but if you're following along, great. If you're sleeping, oh well. When we look at that moment in time and that muscle, those contractile elements of the muscle, let's say the quad, again, hip, glute, hamstring, calf, for that moment in time when they're contracting isometrically, there's no work being done, because work is by definition a change in muscle length. So there's an isometric contraction, but that's not defined as work. In truth, the greater the change in muscle length, the more fuel that is used. The less the change in muscle length, the less fuel that is used by definition. When we look at any elite, what we see is tremendous stiffness in what they're able to do. So what I'm trying to put together here is that the best athletes have to do very little counter movement because they can generate a lot of pretension in the muscle, and that is neurological in nature, right? So everything is happening, it's skill-based. And again, coming back to this body weight workout, and again, this approach that we use, yes, we've got time under load and tension where we're fatiguing motor units and recruiting more motor units as those earlier or smaller motor units are fatiguing, but as important is this idea of muscle slack and co-contraction of all of these muscles to stabilize the joints, and the speed at which force is generated in that curve from the time the muscle is asked to do some kind of work. So these concepts related to the counter movement and the co-contraction and the muscle slack and the speed at which force is generated, these are all critical aspects, not only to stabilize and protect the joints, but to generate speed and to resist fatigue. Because biomechanics and functional biomechanics are a very tricky topic, and when we look at specificity and how we can carry over the supplemental work that we do and have it become a way in which we function better as athletes. And that's why those exercises have produced such powerful benefits in all of you, and while they'll continue to be beneficial for athletes who don't train this way at all. They go into the gym, they bounce in and out of things, so they're just tapping into an elastic component and not generating any force in the contractile components and not getting any stability around the joint and hurting themselves and not getting stronger. Okay, I got to get going. I'll talk to you later.